This afternoon, two giant media personalities are meeting to discuss journalism in the country, even as the subject has become a frequent topic of discussion. First, Executive Director of the Media Foundation for West Africa, Professor Kwame Kakari, and Elizabeth Ohene will be speaking on the topic Journalism Yesterday and Today, Reposition Media with Technology at the maiden 7th anniversary of public lecture of the Ghana Journalists Association. Let's cross over to the Alesa Hotel, where the president of GJA, Afil Moni, is already speaking. Yesterday, we heard the president in his usual articulate best, mounting a rose-tinted defense of his government's press freedom record. And from the media perspective, a major takeaway is that the killers of Ahmed Swale will be found. And we say hallelujah. The point can hardly be articulated that the murder of Ahmed Swale in the most tragic circumstances has eroded Ghana's image as a reference point and standard measure as far as journalism is concerned. So we pray. Some of us believe in prayer. We continue to pray that the perpetrators of this heinous crime will be exposed and made to taste the biting edge of the law. I'm not the speaker, but the speaker, we all know, is all constricted by fear to speak his mind. He demonstrated it during the reverence regime, and he's still the Prof. Kakari we know. We thank him so much for accepting to deliver this lecture within a short space of time. So, Prof, thank you so much. Even though you claim you don't understand the topic, but I believe what will come out what will come out will justify the rectitude of your choice as the speaker of our maiden lecture. The next topic is the media under siege? And this will be handled by His Excellency Yawedu Aibuafo, Chairman of the National Media Commission. On this note, I welcome you all to this afternoon's lecture. It is said that a good cook and a good recipe make for a good meal. The cook, contextually, as I said, is an excellent speaker, a man who is not afraid to speak his mind. And he said it all. So please relax and enjoy the intellectual meal. I thank you.
Mr. President Ronald Afilmoni, Doctor, thank you very much indeed. We'll take one more remark before the speaker mounts the podium. And I'll say something about our Minister of Information. And I'm saying this as a senior citizen. And I'm saying this to journalists. Criticize him, but don't run him down. If you do so, you're running down journalists who are likely to take up such a position in future. That's one mistake that we make. Criticize him, but never, ever run him down. I know what I'm talking about. On that note, let's take a remark from Minister of Information, Honorable Kojo Ponkruma. Thank you.
I'm not sure whether I should say Grandma Chair or Madam Chair.
Grandma Chair.
Grandma Chair is fine. So Grandma Chair, Professor Kakari, Mr. President, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. And mine is simply to say congratulations to the fraternity of journalists in this country and to the Ghana Journalists Association as we celebrate our 70th anniversary. The 70th anniversary celebration allows us to do a number of things, including introspecting into how we go about our work. And as you would find from today's lecture, it's an examination of how journalism has changed or fared over the decades as technology has also changed or fared. From the village scribe who used to post his notes on the tree, to the era of the printing press, to the era of electronic media, and now to online platforms, technology changes the frontiers and also causes some changes in the way we go about our work as journalists. But the integrity of our work, the values associated with it over the centuries, in my view, ought not to change. It will be interesting to see how the good professor examines how technology has affected our work over the years and how we have held on to the values despite competition, clickbait, number of eyeballs, etc., that is happening on the landscape today. But I think for us at the ministry and for us in government, it's exciting that on an occasion like this, we're also using it as an opportunity to introspect and to build another layer that will take our profession a step higher. So I say congratulations once again, and we look forward to that lecture. Thank you.
Honorable Minister, thank you very much indeed for such brief remarks. Now to the reason why we are here, the business for today. Journalism yesterday and today, repositioning media and technology. I relate to the speaker today, and I want to recall that in the heady days of confusion in this country, where we didn't have a head or tail of where this country was going, he would pick me up from my house at midnight for a meeting. I hope you remember that, Prof. And my children would be saying, Daddy, don't go, the soldiers will kill you. And I said, they won't kill me, I'm with my boss. And I would go and I would come back. I have confidence in this gentleman, and I'll always have confidence in him. He meant well, he means well, and I buy into his bravery and his confidence level. These are the men who speak the truth without fear or favor. So I think we couldn't have got a better person to speak on this subject matter than the gentleman I'm going to introduce to you. A former Executive Director, Media Foundation for West Africa. Former Dean, School of Communication Studies, University of Ghana, Legon. Former Chairman, Board of Graphic Communications Limited. And and current Dean, School of Communication Studies, Wisconsin University College. Professor Kwame Kakari is our speaker on the subject matter of journalism yesterday and today, repositioning media and technology. And talking about technology before he comes in, we were using UHA recorder. That was as much as heavy as our weight to go around to record in those days. Now, the recorders they use are these. This GBC, even GBC is using this. So we have come really far. How does that impact our work as journalists? Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together. Let's welcome Professor Kwame. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Madam Chair, Honorable Minister, Mr. President, veteran and respectable media people here. I told Afil that the subject they gave to me was incomprehensible. It was incomprehensible, first of all, on the face of it, but also those of you who saw the posted announcement of the topic, you would have seen that the GJA that was promoting this program was itself showing us some of the flaws of journalism today. It showed how poorly edited material in our media are today. The spelling of it was wrong, and the phraseology itself was really difficult to comprehend. So you don't know what. So I chose to do it the way I didn't understand it. But on a more serious note, it's gratifying to see so many people here, because a lot of time we get so despondent that we forget about some of the really valuable and good things and progress that this country has made. First of all, the person in the chair today is an example of excellence in journalism. Here among us, Professor Les Kwamin here and Wilna Kwamin here represent a major new development in our media landscape. That is the introduction and development of community radio. When we talk about journalism in the past, right here in front of me are two inimitable editors of the Catholic Standard, a church-owned newspaper which represented one of the traditions in our print journalism from way back in the latter part of the 19th century up to much of the last century, which did not confine themselves to just proselytizing the Holy Word, but also true to the spirit and nature of the church, involving themselves in the work of the freedom of the citizens where they find themselves. There is also here Mr. Ampofo, a really wonderful television presenter. All of the people here that I know and who know I know them are people who have made very important contributions to journalism in this country, including our minister here, who was quite an excellent radio presenter before he diverted into politics. I hope one day when he leaves politics, he will come back to the media, because it happens in many places. People come back to that profession with the experiences that they have got, and it will be very helpful to the industry. What I want to do in a very short time, and I don't know how you understand the topic, but what I'm going to try to do may be mostly historical. If they are not interesting to you, please pardon me. Perhaps you might learn one date in the... What I'm going to try to do, because of the question of journalism yesterday and today, repositioning media with technology, what I'm going to try to do is to do a broad sweep of the development of the technologies of mass communication, and then conclude with my own understanding of the different phases of the practice of journalism since the first newspaper came into our land here up to today. This will be very brief because, again, we can't strictly talk about yesterday. We can talk about yesterdays. Because when it comes to the media, there have been many yesterdays. The colonial time, the one-party post-independent period, the military regimes, the intersperson multi-party democratic attempts, and then our current long-standing, hopefully sustaining Fourth Republic. All of these have had some characteristics of journalism peculiar to them. However, there are some strains of journalisms that crisscross all of these different eras. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll try and do a history that I know many of my colleagues here, Bona Kumsen, Alex Kwamin, and others are all well aware of. But I don't think there is anything wrong with emphasis, or Dregajipo and others here. And I hope that Audrey, Bona, or Alex, if I mixed up a date or two, you correct us so that everybody here will learn. Madam Chair, journalism, or mass communication for that matter, was made possible and has grown to become a normal cultural feature of daily life in modern society with the development and innovations in communications technologies. It is an extension of human social communication, enhanced and made complex by technology. Ladies and gentlemen, the organizers explained to me that I'm expected to discuss journalism as it was in the past and as it is today, and link it with how it has been influenced or affected by technological developments over the years. So this is how I propose to proceed. I'll go over the development of communication technologies over the years and how these developments have shaped mass communication, mass media communication over the years generally. Then I'll take up the equally challenging task of surveying journalism practice from the beginnings to our own time. This is a conversation of developments, many of which outlines and elements, as I've said already, all or most of you may be familiar with. So I indulge you to have patience with me so we can have a fruitful and purposeful discussion later. The book and the newspaper, the first media of mass communication, were the direct products of the invention of the movable printing press by the German in 1453 in Gutenberg. Indeed, because Germany and all of the European world were under the political and ideological dominance of the Catholic Church at the time, it was logical that the first book to enjoy a certain mass production was the Christian Bible. Even then, the lesson here is that because the political authority limited access to the Bible at the time, the mass production of the Holy Book could be possible only after the Reformation of Martin Luther freed the book from the censorship of the Pope and his autocratic government in Rome. The lesson then is that access to mass communication is and has always been a question of political right attained through struggle. The newspaper was the sole medium of mass communication in Europe and North America for nearly 300 years before radio broadcasting joined the race just about 100 years ago. Innovations in the technology of printing enhanced the rise of many publications from country to country and exploded during and after the Industrial Revolution with the invention of the steam and later electrical sources of energy. Socially, the significant issue is that The growth of the newspaper was made possible by developments and expansion in education, literacy, and in the economic progress and personal incomes, especially wage incomes. In other words, the newspaper is impossible to emerge or be sustained anywhere if there are no people who can read. In our own society here, the newspaper started in Cape Coast, and for a very long time, there were many newspapers in Cape Coast, then in Accra. But this was because there was a community of people who could read in those urban areas. Yet again, the growth of the newspaper as a medium of mass communication was a process that encountered and struggled against the authoritarian restrictions of governments. These included censorship, vicious repression, inimical laws, and outright bans and imprisonments all over the world over the centuries. In the United Kingdom, or in Britain, which became our colonial overlord and from whom we have learned many traditions and things, many of the inimical laws, sedition, seditious libel, and so on and so forth, were introduced, especially under the monarchies, to silence the voices of the new emerging middle classes and working classes. Elsewhere, all over, whether it was in France or in Russia or in Germany, there were laws that restricted the newspapers from developing or people using the newspapers for communicating ideas. In Ghana here, all of these developments characterize the development and growth of the newspaper. The Bannerman brothers, who pioneered the newspaper industry, initially had no access to the new technology of printing until they moved to Freetown, where the technology had been introduced much earlier. When they moved their project back to Accra, there were now presses owned by missionary organizations and later some European merchant companies. James Hutton Bruce successfully sustained newspaper publishing enterprise lasting from 1874 to the beginnings of the 20th century was made possible because by then Cape Coast, the business and political capital, boasted printing presses, including his own. It is recorded that John Mensah Saba used the fees paid him by the colony's chiefs for defending them against British attempts to confiscate their lands to purchase the printing press which the Aborigines Rights Protection Society used to print their newspaper, the Gold Coast Aborigine. The pioneering newspaper publishers of the time, as had been in Europe and North America before, were usually their own writers, editors, and printers. Madam Chair, I want us to turn now to the development of telegraphy and telecommunication. Ladies and gentlemen, if the invention of the movable printing press introduced written mass communication, the invention some 3 centuries later of telegraphy and telecommunication revolutionized mass communication up to today. This revolution started with the invention of electricity in the 1830s, followed by the invention of telegraphy and telecommunication. The telegraph technology accelerated the gathering and circulation of information because now newspapers could receive news or information from distant places. The telegraph community brought about what we now call the war correspondent and reporters on economic and business issues. Above all, the new telecommunication technology brought about the news agency, the institution called the news agency that is, media organizations using the wired network systems to collect and distribute news and information used by newspapers at the time. The development of the telephone, which was introduced in 1876, accelerated media development. It meant that now people could transmit the human voice and other sounds from one point to a distant place. Soon it was discovered that through other innovations and inventions, sound could be transmitted not only to farther distances, but to large numbers of people in diverse places over distant spaces. Now, technology made possible the transmission of text as image and sound. This is the origin of radio broadcasting. It was the product of the development of telecommunication. By 1920, and about 100 years exactly this year, the first radio broadcast to the public was in place. But radio broadcasting could be, as we have known it, only with the inventions and innovations in other technologies, especially for sound recording and reproduction. First, there had to be the development of celluloid, the tape for recording or capturing sound, and later images for sound recording, and the invention of the tape recorder. It was followed almost immediately with the invention of the phonograph by Edison in 1877. Then followed the gramophone, thus the birth of the modern music industry, popularization of music, the emergence of music making as a profession, acceleration of the development of popular culture, and so on and so forth. Radio could now broadcast not just recorded music, but recorded speeches, including voices of people from events occurring in distant places to give authenticity and the appearance of reality to audiences. Now, talking about the gramophone, when I was a little, I think primary 3 or thereabout, my great-grand-uncle, Nana Kwesiade, had a gramophone. And there was a record by an old a popular musician called Kwamensa. And the recording, the music would be playing, and then Kwamensa, who was the leader in the band, in the recording, would shout, "Munyai, wasai nyumno." Apparently, the European or the English engineers who were recording it didn't understand it and thought it was part of the music. So it stayed up till the record came out. But also, the gramophone record, very interestingly, see nowadays, our politicians, when they are campaigning, use radio, they use these new applications and so on. I remember that in the 1950s, there was my grandfather, my great-grandfather, this same great-grandfather, who was in Achimwa reside, and they were all supporters of J.B. Dankwa, had a record of J.B. Dankwa talking something political. I don't remember what it was, but it was a speech on the vinyl, the old kind of thing, which means that this technology for mass communication was used in so many different ways. Now, these developments that have been recounted added to the earlier. These developments that we have recounted added to the earlier perceptions of communication effects, such as the famous concepts of the bullet or hypodermic needle theories of old. In other words, for some time past, scholars considered those new technologies and their effects as being almost instantaneous on people. That is that if there was a radio broadcast, it had instant effect on people. Of course, later research has refuted those claims. But precisely because of the character of the technology at the time, it also influenced theory and scholarship at the same time among the scholars who were studying communications issues in those days. Improvements in the technology of radio transmission and reception continue to make radio the quintessential mass medium even unto today. The transistor technology, introduced in the 1940s, radicalized media communication technology. The transistor introduced miniaturization, that is, making things smaller. The radio's receiver became wireless and smaller. You could carry the radio anywhere, even in your pocket. The same thing occurred with the tape recorder and the music player. It made the journalist's work easier, more efficient, and the listener's reception clearer, and access to radio cheaper or more affordable. So more and more people were brought into the culture of mass communication with the developments of the technology. I think Godwin was talking about the technologies used in GBC, the UHA. The UHA was, you know, you needed a kaya or somebody to carry it. In 1983 at GBC, I visited the Ejura transmitter station. You know, for the external broadcasting services, there was a transmitter in Tema and another one in Ejura. I visited the Ejura transmitter station. The transmitters there and also the transmitters in Tema had to fill halls which were as large as here. They were so huge. And the Ejura transmitter, I found out when I went there, consumed 32 gallons of diesel an hour. And the electricity power it could generate, I was told, at that time could power a whole town of Sunyani, a whole city of Sunyani and perhaps Brekum combined. That was how big those transmitters were. Now, fast forward to, I think, 1995 or thereabout, Bona, when Radio Universe we started. The students, the SRC, the School of Communication Studies, and the university combined to set up the radio station. So we chose the frequency that Joy FM is on now, 99.7, because the engineer told us that it is one of the clearest signals. So we chose it. That was before Joy FM came in. But then later on, we were told that it was a GBC frequency kept for GBC. But then, at the time, the government apparently took it from GBC and gave it to the people who started Joy FM. So a military officer or military officers came from the Frequency Registration Board, which was at the time considered a security agency. So some soldiers came to my office as director of the school at the time to ask us to shut down the transmitter. So the soldiers asked us where the transmitter was. It was 1995 or 4. So we took them to the studios and the building. They couldn't find the transmitter. Why couldn't they find the transmitter? The transmitter was like this book. It was just lying somewhere. They couldn't find it. And that is how the technology had changed from the 1960s to 1995. A transmitter that, you know, was just sitting there. You could put it in, what do you call it, your bag. And that is why also all kinds of organizations, liberation movements, terrorist organizations, whatever, political parties, all kinds of groups set up radio stations that their authorities couldn't track down because they could move the transmitter everywhere they wanted. So these innovations have made life much better. Now, further innovations, introducing the integrated circuit technology, accelerated miniaturization to the extent that now you have both radio receiver and the telephone in the palm of your hand. That you can have radio and telephone in your hand, in your handbag, in your pocket, is because of the technology of the integrated circuit. That helps make things smaller. Now, television. All of the developments in communications technology we have noted above, culminating in radio broadcasting, formed the foundation for the development of television. That is, combining sound to images and making even more powerful reception of information. It started with the introduction of still photography in the 1830s, followed in the 1870s by experiments in motion picture development. By 1929, there were experiments in television transmission in the United Kingdom. In 1936, regular television transmission started in and around London, following the recommendation by a government committee to BBC to start television broadcasting. In 1939, TV broadcasting was suspended because of the outbreak of World War II, but it was resumed in 1946, expanding further mass communication in the UK and later across the world. And we here introduced TV in 1965, 19 years later. Remember also that we started radio broadcasting here about 16 years after it was introduced. In the meantime, broadcasting was profoundly enhanced by the introduction of satellite technology. The first color TV programs appeared on BBC Two in 1967. That is 2 years after we had started TV, but in our case in black and white. Here in Ghana, we had color in 1985. Godwin, I think I'm 85 or 86, I think 85. In the meantime, broadcasting was profoundly enhanced by the introduction of satellite technology. You remember when Kutunsi was opened, the first major transmission was of the royal wedding of Prince Charles and Diana, which was beamed directly here. And on that day, I don't think even a bird flew. Everybody stuck to the TV to watch. Satellite technology expanded many, many times over the coverage of events and distribution of cultural products by radio and TV around the globe. It helped make the world of news and information smaller and closer. News and other information were available to people in all corners of the globe and faster. By the end of the 1980s, innovations in digital technology with the introduction of the computer and the internet would transform person to person as well as mass communication, a mesmerizing phenomenon. These innovations particularly enhance the potential of people's freedom of expression in many ways. In mass communication, it meant that people wouldn't be simple passive recipients or consumers of information. Interactivity between audiences and media, and contributions of ordinary people to media production, the so-called citizen journalism, were now a beneficial reality. In Africa, Access to all these refined and wonderful technologies meant serious economic challenges, economic liabilities. It raises the larger question of technological dependency and the challenges of promoting developments in communications technology. When I went to GBC in 1982, the television studio had only one working camera. And that one working camera was put together by some sellotape strips. And it was black and white. Yet we needed to transit to color. But the government had no money. It was the Japanese government that gave us a grant of $3 million that helped GBC to transit to color television. So the point I'm making here is that because we don't produce in our economy the technologies, whenever there are innovations, these innovations add extra burdens on our economic capacities. But even more importantly, whereas we also benefited from these advances in technology, in my view, culturally and ideologically, the new technologies make us more subservient to the cultures and political domination of other cultures and geopolitical forces, especially the Western powers. In a way, our dependency enhanced what in the 1970s and 1980s some scholars termed cultural imperialism. Madam Chair, I will pause here with the technology and go into the other aspect of our discussion today, that is journalism past and present. I'm glad, as our Lady Chair emphasized, there is no mention of the future here. First of all, the future is so difficult to ponder, and to attempt to get into that, we might get into unnecessary speculation. So let's just stop. Except that when we talk about the past, we were all not there. And so we can only recall what others, such as the great J.B. Jones Quartey and others have documented. And then, of course, from the newspaper archives, which are all, unfortunately, becoming dust in our archives and wherever they are held. It's a very sad situation. One time, I was doing some research, that was about 1990. So I went to Kumasi, to the offices of the Pioneer newspaper. At the time, the publisher, Mr. Thibault, that is the son of the original publisher, was in charge. So I asked him I wanted to study the past copies of that newspaper. So he took me to a room and he found just about a dozen copies. The first 5th edition of the paper was the oldest he could give me. So I asked him, where is the rest of the paper that was published from 1937? He told me, Kwame, I am a teetotaler. If I tell you now what happened to our archive, you will make me turn to drink. I said, what happened? He had left the place in charge of somebody for some months because he was away doing other things. When he came back, he was told that the people he left the place with had sold the archive from 1937 to groundnut sellers. Professor P.A.B. Ansan was alive at the time. I told him because he knew what I wanted to do. And you know, Professor, sometimes very, he hit the roof. He said, you know, he's going to get Mr. Tibu to get the person arrested. Mr. Tibu said, well, I am your first man then. But the point I'm making is that our archives, that is particularly those in private hands, are not in a very good shape. But what have all of what we've said got to do with journalism in Ghana, past and present? First, the definition of journalism. Traditionally, journalism meant the collection, production, and dissemination of the day's news events or occurrences and related information. That was when the newspaper was the only medium of mass communication. But then, over time, the coming of radio and television and the introduction of other kinds and formats of media content have expanded the roles and therefore the definition of journalism to include production of many other kinds of media content, particularly those related to news and current affairs. Now, the nature of journalism over time. For the first century of journalism in the Gold Coast, Ghana, that is from 1857 to about the 1950s, from the Bannerman brothers' pioneering newspaper business through James Hutton Bruce's sustained efforts, through the journalism of Mensah Saba, the Kesley Hayfords, and so on until the 1950s, journalism was largely adversarial, opinionated, with little by way of reports of occurrences or news as we know it today. In the 1930s, however, there were two distinct developments. First, there emerged as owners and promoters of media gentlemen who were not necessarily intellectuals but businessmen. Two of them stand out very strongly. One is A.J. Okansi of the famous African Morning Post and other newspapers. And A.J. Okansi was very important in the development of communication in this country because he was also a pioneer of the cinema in this country. There were cinema houses that he owned. One of them, I understand, is Palladium. Then also, he actually introduced this whole vocation of radio repairing. Because radio was coming into the system, he set up a technical post. One of his cinema houses is also called Okansi in Kumasi, near the old, railway station. E.J. Okansi set up a number of newspapers. He was also a pioneer in publishing a newspaper in Ghanaian language. The other person was Mr. W.E. Tibu, who founded in 1937 the first significant and sustained newspaper publication in Kumasi, the Ashanti Pioneer. The other development in those days was the employment of professional editors besides the publishers or owners. That is that until then, quite most of the time, the publishers were themselves the editors. A.J. Okansi and Tibu, now as owners, did not dabble in the editorial work. They employed independent editors, and that's how come A.J. Okansi brought into this country Nnamdi Azikiwe, who had of the anti-colonial movement and agitation in the colonial world also enhanced or catalyzed the development of political parties. And the development of the political parties also meant the emergence of the party press for agitation, polemics, propaganda, and what have you. The party press was most exemplified by the CPP's numerous publications. Kwame Nkrumah and his CPP comrades established the Accra Evening News. It started off as a one-sheet, two-page newspaper circulating all over and came out in the afternoons in Accra here. Again, to talk about the development of the press, some of these traditions died long ago. Otherwise, there were newspapers, apart from the evening news, that also came out, not in the morning, but in the later afternoon. The CBP also set up the Kumasi Sentinel. They also set up Takoradi Times. And one significant thing about Takoradi Times is that that was the first time a woman edited a newspaper in this country. Audrey, what's her name?
Skek.
Yes, yes, Skek. Then also, they founded the Cape Coast Mail, which was edited by Kweku Baku's father, Kofi Baku, and others later coming out of the Guinea Press stable. Later on, the CBP government, especially when they had decreed that there would be only one party in this country, and when the party had also adopted the socialist ideology and programs and so on, they churned out a number of publications owned by the party and coming out of the Guinea Press. Indeed, the Guinea Press, I think, the Guinea Press metamorphosed into the Ghanaian Times. Yes. Now, in Kumasi, the National Liberation Movement also had the Liberator to fight back the CPP. All the big six on our currency now, except Obechebi Lamte and William Oforiatta, published a newspaper or newspapers at one time or another. Now, J.B. Dankwa published several newspapers in his time, including the very first attempt at daily newspaper production in this country. Now, I once interviewed the late Akweje about his own newspaper and others at the time. And Akweje told me that J.B. Dankwa's newspaper didn't survive much. And I asked him why. He said J.B. Dankwa's newspapers were killed by vendors. You know who vendors are? Okay. I don't think many of you know, because nowadays most people don't read newspapers. Akweje published the African National Times, and Akufo-Addo, the president's father, published the Statesman. And of course, I've mentioned Kwame Nkrumah and J.B. Dankwa and what they published. The journalism of the party press was rancorous, polemical, propagandist, and they specialized in character assassination and the tradition of insult in political communication, which was revived in the Fourth Republic electioneering campaigns. That is an ugly tradition they left us. The CPP's and NLM's newspapers were particularly specialized in this kind of press journalism, so their journalists were quite often railroaded to the courts on charges of defamation. The CPP's press's irreverence and hard-hitting attacks on the colonial administration ended numerous court cases on charges of the infamous sedition and criminal libel. Now we come to Graphic and the new journalism. The story of Graphic as a modern newspaper business organization was started by Cecil Keane of the Mirror Group of London, which entered into the colonial market. That is that in the 1950s, late 40s and 50s, Cecil Keane, who was a newspaper mogul in Britain, a chairman of the board of the Mirror Group of companies, the Mirror Group of papers in London, ventured into the colonies. So in Sierra Leone, for instance, he invested in the newspaper called the Mail, the Daily Mail, In Lagos, the Lagos Times, and here, the West Africa Graphic, which became a graphic, the graphic as we know it. Graphic is a very interesting story because when Cecil King came in here for over a year, there was a big fight between an organization of the local publishers of newspapers against the graphic. So sometimes, because the graphic newspapers were attacked when the trucks were going, Cecil King and his people hired boxers to protect the graphic trucks. But the important thing is that graphic came in as a modern business organization with very good investment and also with infrastructure, modern printing presses, trucks that took the newspaper far and wide in the country. And that's how come very soon, everywhere, people identified newspaper as graphic because it was the most visible, the most well-distributed, and also because it brought a certain new journalism, a journalism that was not a part of the rancorous environment of newspaper publishing, became appealing to so many people in the country. People would buy those other newspapers, but they still would buy the graphic to authenticate whatever they had read elsewhere. And it was bigger, it was nicely printed, packaged, and so on. Now, graphic at the time, according to a man, Babatunde Jose, a man who was an MD of the Lagos Times, in his memoirs, he pointed out that when the graphic was set up here, one of the facilities that Cecil King did not introduce here was the picture processing facility. So the graphic would every day send a car with the negatives of the film, of photographs, their camera people, to Lagos to process it and bring it back here for printing. Now, graphic, therefore, my own assessment is that the death of the local newspaper industry, that's the Ghanaian-owned newspaper, because they were very woefully capitalized, and because they all got embroiled in the rancorous politics of the time, I think all of these contributed to the graphic wiping them out as an industry. However, graphic weakened them, weakened all of these newspapers. But the actual death knell of the development of the local newspaper industry was the laws and the preventive detention government introduced in the country. The newspapers had been so weakened by competition with the graphic, and so I think that when Nkrumah introduced the newspaper licensing law, which meant that the Minister of Information alone had the power to sanction whether a newspaper would be published or not, it therefore killed the industry, and that's my reading of the developments. And it's very interesting to look at the tenure of ministers of information in this country. In fact, there were 2 ministers of information who served for only 2 weeks. Adalmote, but also Toto, I think he was, yeah. And then, of course, at one point in the 60s, Kwame Nkrumah himself had to take over the position of Minister of Information. It just shows you how important that position was for government and its management and control of public communication. For a very long time, the MPP, the leaders of the MPP, before they came into office, if you recall, had always had as part of their arrangements to scrap the idea of a ministry or a minister of information as an anathema. But we live in Ghana and things continue. Now, let's move forward, please. The first editor of the Daily Graphic was Martin Thurston Kofi, who was brought down from Ashanti Times in Obuasi. Now, Ashanti Times is interesting for two main reasons. One, the Ashanti Times and the short-lived Bebiani Times were new investment efforts by the mining businesses into the newspaper industry, as they had done in South Africa and elsewhere. So the first significance is that big business was now coming into the newspaper industry. Second is that the Ashanti Times and the Bibiani Times were also beginning to introduce new journalism, that is much more professionalized journalism practice, away from the diatribe and polemical character of the party press. Because the Ashanti Times also, which came on in 1948, also sent some of their editors, some of their reporters to Fleet Street, which was the colony of newspaper industry in London, for training. Now, so Ashanti Times also contributed to modern journalism in that case. Now, in 1953 comes the Mirror newspaper, which introduced into our newspaper culture pin-up girls, fashion, short story writing, and the tradition of satire or humor writing, producing great synonyms like Kwesi Dompo, but a tradition which ended in the 1980s with the intriguingly hilarious columns of Kwesi Yanka under the bylon Quitrot. In other words, the Graphic, the Mirror, introduced some very important journalistic traditions that seem to have faded. One is satirical writing, that is laughing at authority by way of humor and Aesopian styles. Then also short story writing. The Mirror still carries it, but I don't know how dynamic they are. But it's also very interesting that even in those days, the Mirror or the Graphic, I don't remember, but one of them used to serialize a whole manuscript of novels. In other words, these newspapers were trying to do what in the European world culture of newspaper business, promotion of literary culture, and so on. Now, magazines. Magazines have not been a successful media business in Ghana. I don't understand it, and I don't know why. Audrey here started something, and I suspect she still owes some people some money. But of course, there has been some significant ones, like Obasima by our late sister. Magazines have not been successful, but their appearance have often been mostly short-lived and not making much impact. However, the South African Drum made big impact in terms of magazine journalism, glamour, fashion, and short story writing. And the Drum gave this country, I believe, some of the incomparably great newspaper editors like Henry Ofori and Cameron Diodu. And Cameron Diodu's novel, The Gap Boys, if you will ever find it, get it to read it. Because Cameron Diodu's The Gap Boys...
70th GJA public lectures there, Professor Kwame Kakari speaking there on that subject, technology and the media yesterday, the media today. We're still keeping our eyes on that program, but right now I'm handing over to Business Live. Daryl Kwa will be here to take you through it, but we'll be crossing over every now and then to the Alisa Hotel to pick up what's happening there as far as the GJA public lecture is concerned. Do stay with us. My name is Gifty, and Pia, many thanks for your time.
In the stunting of creativity,